My name is William Harrison. I am 70 years old, and for the past 4 decades I have bled, sweated, and sacrificed everything to build a logistics and industrial real estate empire right here in Dallas, Texas. I did not inherit a single dime. I started with one used freight truck and a lot of sleepless nights. My late wife Diane stood by me when we had nothing but instant noodles in the pantry and dreams that seemed too big for our tiny apartment. Together we built a fortune. We gave our son Derek a life of absolute privilege. Private schools, luxury cars, a debt-free college education. We gave him the world. Diane passed away 4 years ago. Before she took her last breath, she held my hand and whispered a warning I refused to listen to at the time. She told me to be careful with Derek. She said he loved the money more than he loved the family. I brushed it off as the anxiety of a dying mother. I wanted to believe my son was a good man. I promoted him to branch chief operating officer of my company, hoping the responsibility would mature him. A week ago, I finalized the biggest deal of my life. A massive multinational corporation bought my logistics empire for $80 million. The money was wired securely into a private holding account. Nobody knew about the sale. Not the public, not the employees, and certainly not my son. My plan was to put the entire $80 million into a secure family trust and hand the management over to Derek. I wanted to secure his future and his children's futures for generations to come, but Diane's dying words kept echoing in my mind. Be careful with Derek. I needed to know if the boy I raised was worthy of that kind of power. I needed to know if he loved me as a father or if he only loved me as an open wallet. So I decided to run one final stress test. I called Derek and his wife Rachel and asked them to come to my home immediately. My estate in Dallas is a sprawling property worth over $3 million, filled with custom woodwork, imported marble, and the echoes of a lifetime of hard work. I made sure the house was quiet and dimly lit when they arrived. I intentionally wore an old wrinkled shirt. I messed up my hair. I rubbed my eyes until they were red and bloodshot, making myself look like a man who had not slept in days, a man hovering on the edge of a total collapse. They walked into my study looking impatient. Rachel was checking her expensive smartwatch, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the leather of her designer handbag. Derek looked annoyed that I had interrupted his evening. I asked them to sit down. I took a deep, trembling breath, channeling every ounce of sorrow I had inside me. I looked at my son with tears welling in my eyes. I told them I had made a terrible mistake. I fabricated a story about a massive off-the-books industrial real estate investment that had completely collapsed. I told them the market shifted, the partners pulled out, and I was left holding the bag. I looked down at my trembling hands and delivered the punchline. I am bankrupt, Derek. The company accounts are drained. The bank is going to foreclose on everything by the end of the month. I have absolutely nothing left. I am going to have to sell this house immediately, just to avoid going to federal prison for debt default. I waited for the shock. I waited for my son to jump out of his chair to hug me, to tell me that we would figure it out together. I waited for him to say that money did not matter as long as we had each other. I waited for the boy I had carried on my shoulders to show a shred of humanity. Instead, silence stretched across the room. It was not a silence of grief. It was a thick, heavy silence of calculation. Derek did not reach out to comfort me. He leaned back in his leather chair. He crossed his arms over his chest. He looked around my beautiful study, letting his eyes trace the expensive crown molding and the antique bookshelves. Then he looked back at me. His eyes were completely cold. There was no pity. There was no love. There was only a predatory gleam that made my stomach churn. He let out a long breath and muttered 2 words that I will never be able to erase from my memory. About time. My heart stopped. I stared at him, pretending to be confused, but inside my soul was fracturing. What did you say, son? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He scoffed, shaking his head. I said it is about time you faced reality, Dad. You have been holding on to this massive house like a museum for Mom. It is a financial sinkhole. And honestly, you should not have been making reckless investments at your age anyway. Rachel chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She reached over and patted my knee, but her touch felt like ice. She said, "We just want what is best for you, William. This house is too much for you to maintain alone anyway. You need to downsize. We can help you sell it quickly before the bank takes it." I sat there paralyzed. My wife was right. My brilliant, beautiful Diane had seen the rot in our son's heart years ago. They were not mourning my financial ruin. They were relieved. They were calculating their next move. But I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I had to play the part. I let a few tears spill over my cheeks and nodded slowly, acting like a defeated, broken old man who had no fight left in him. "Thank you," I whispered, keeping my head bowed so they would not see the cold fury igniting in my eyes. "I do not know what I would do without you both." Derek smiled. It was a chilling corporate smile. "Do not worry about a thing, Dad. I will handle the sale. I will make sure everything is taken care of. Just rest." They left my house 30 minutes later, practically jogging to their luxury car. They thought they had won. They thought they were leaving behind a helpless victim. But they had just stepped blindly into a trap, and I was going to let them dig their own graves. I told my son I was bankrupt and had to sell the estate just to survive. His immediate response was 2 words that froze the blood in my veins. "About time." He thought I was ruined. He thought I was a broken old man begging for scraps. He had no idea I had just sold my logistics empire for $80 million in cash. And he had no idea this was a calculated test. A test he was failing spectacularly. What I overheard him saying the next morning, "Well, if you think you know family betrayal, take a deep breath. I am 70 years old, and for 4 decades I sacrificed everything to build a logistics real estate empire here in Dallas, Texas. I did not inherit a single dime. I started with 1 used freight truck and a lot of sleepless nights. My late wife Diane stood by me when we had nothing but instant noodles in the pantry and dreams that seemed too big for our tiny apartment. Together, we built a fortune. We gave our son Derek a life of absolute privilege. Private schools, luxury cars, a debt-free college education. We gave him the world. Diane passed away 4 years ago. Before she took her last breath, she held my hand and whispered a warning I refused to listen to at the time. She told me to be careful with Derek. She said he loved the money more than he loved the family. I brushed it off as the anxiety of a dying mother. I wanted to believe my son was a good man. I promoted him to branch chief operating officer of my company, hoping the responsibility would mature him. A week ago, I finalized the biggest deal of my life. A massive multinational corporation bought my logistics empire for $80 million. The money was wired securely into a private holding account. Nobody knew about the sale. Not the public, not the employees, and certainly not my son. My plan was to put the entire $80 million into a secure family trust and hand the management over to Derek. I wanted to secure his future and his children's future for generations to come. But Diane's dying words kept echoing in my mind. Be careful with Derek. I needed to know if the boy I raised was worthy of that kind of power. I needed to know if he loved me as a father, or if he only loved me as an open wallet. So I decided to run one final stress test. I called Derek and his wife Rachel and asked them to come to my home immediately. My estate in Dallas is a sprawling property worth over $3 million, filled with custom woodwork, imported marble, and the echoes of a lifetime of hard work. I made sure the house was quiet and dimly lit when they arrived. I intentionally wore an old wrinkled shirt. I messed up my hair. I rubbed my eyes until they were red and bloodshot, making myself look like a man who had not slept in days, a man hovering on the edge of a total collapse. They walked into my study looking impatient. Rachel was checking her expensive smartwatch, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the leather of her designer handbag. Derek looked annoyed that I had interrupted his evening. I asked them to sit down. I took a deep, trembling breath, channeling every ounce of sorrow I had inside me. I looked at my son with tears welling in my eyes. I told them I had made a terrible mistake. I fabricated a story about a massive off-the-books industrial real estate investment that had completely collapsed. I told them the market shifted, the partners pulled out, and I was left holding the bag. I looked down at my trembling hands and delivered the punchline. I am bankrupt, Derek. The company accounts are drained. The bank is going to foreclose on everything by the end of the month. I have absolutely nothing left. I am going to have to sell this house immediately, just to avoid going to federal prison for debt default. I waited for the shock. I waited for my son to jump out of his chair to hug me, to tell me that we would figure it out together. I waited for him to say that money did not matter as long as we had each other. I waited for the boy I had carried on my shoulders to show a shred of humanity. Instead, silence stretched across the room. It was not a silence of grief. It was a thick, heavy silence of calculation. Derek did not reach out to comfort me. He leaned back in his leather chair. He crossed his arms over his chest. He looked around my beautiful study, letting his eyes trace the expensive crown molding and the antique bookshelves. Then he looked back at me. His eyes were completely cold. There was no pity. There was no love. There was only a predatory gleam that made my stomach churn. He let out a long breath and muttered two words that I will never be able to erase from my memory. About time. My heart stopped. I stared at him, pretending to be confused, but inside my soul was fracturing. "What did you say, son?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He scoffed, shaking his head. "I said it is about time you faced reality, Dad. You have been holding on to this massive house like a museum for Mom. It is a financial sinkhole. And honestly, you should not have been making reckless investments at your age anyway." Rachel chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She reached over and patted my knee, but her touch felt like ice. She said, "We just want what is best for you, William. This house is too much for you to maintain alone anyway. You need to downsize. We can help you sell it quickly before the bank takes it." I sat there paralyzed. My wife was right. My brilliant, beautiful Diane had seen the rot in our son heart years ago. They were not mourning my financial ruin. They were relieved. They were calculating their next move. But I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I had to play the part. I let a few tears spill over my cheeks and nodded slowly, acting like a defeated, broken old man who had no fight left in him. "Thank you," I whispered, keeping my head bowed so they would not see the cold fury igniting in my eyes. "I do not know what I would do without you both." Derek smiled. It was a chilling corporate smile. "Do not worry about a thing, Dad. I will handle the sale. I will make sure everything is taken care of. Just rest." They left my house 30 minutes later, jogging to their luxury car. They thought they had won. They thought they were leaving behind a helpless victim. But they had just stepped blindly into a trap, and I was going to let them dig their own graves. I watched from the window as they stood by their luxury car in my driveway. They did not leave right away. Through the glass, I could see Derek pacing. He was waving his hands, talking frantically to Rachel. He must have realized how cold and heartless his initial reaction had sounded. A few minutes later, they turned around and walked right back up the steps to my front door. I quickly returned to my armchair and put my head in my hands, forcing my shoulders to shake as if I were weeping silently. The heavy oak doors of my study creaked open again. Derek walked in first. The cold, calculating expression he wore just moments ago had completely vanished. In its place was a carefully constructed mask of deep filial concern. He knelt beside my chair and placed a warm hand on my shoulder. He let out a soft, practiced sigh. "Dad, I am so sorry," he murmured, his voice dripping with fabricated empathy. "I think you completely misunderstood what I meant earlier. When I said it was about time, I did not mean it maliciously. I was just shocked. I meant that it is about time you finally let go of this massive burden. You have been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders for 4 years since Mom died. This house is not a home anymore. It is a museum filled with painful memories. Every corner of this estate just reminds you of her. Maintaining a $3 million property alone while trying to save a struggling business is too much for one man. I was just relieved that you are finally stepping away from all this immense stress. I kept my head bowed, letting out a ragged breath. I listened to my son spin his web of lies with the precision of a seasoned con artist. If I had not seen the predatory gleam in his eyes earlier, I might have actually believed him. I might have thought he was a loving son trying to comfort a broken father. But I knew the truth. Still, I had to play my part. I looked up at him, allowing my eyes to appear vacant and desperate. "Do you really mean that, Derek? That's all?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly. "You are not disappointed in me. You are not ashamed that your father lost everything." Derek squeezed my shoulder, giving me a reassuring smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course not, Dad. We are family. Family protects each other when things get tough. You spent your whole life providing for us, and now it is our turn to take care of you. We are going to fix this together." Rachel stepped into the room perfectly on cue. She carried a tray with a glass of water and a warm towel. She set it gently on my desk and kneeled next to Derek. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law flawlessly. "William, you do not need to worry about a single thing," she said, her tone soft and melodic. "Derek and I have been talking about a plan to get you out of this mess. You said the bank is going to foreclose by the end of the month. Well, Derek knows a private cash buyer who specializes in distressed properties. He buys large estates as is without requiring any inspections or lengthy bank approvals. He can close on this house this week. You will have the cash you need to pay your debts and avoid prison." I swallowed, the bitter disgust rising in my throat. A cash buyer. Closing this week. It was almost too convenient. Real estate transactions of this magnitude took months of negotiations, inspections, and legal reviews. The fact that Derek magically had a buyer lined up ready to drop millions of dollars in a matter of days was a glaring red flag. But I nodded slowly, sipping the water Rachel handed me. "But where will I go?" I asked, letting my hands tremble against the glass. "If we sell the house this week, I will be homeless. I have no money for an apartment. I cannot afford anything." Rachel smiled warmly, exchanging a quick, knowing glance with Derek. "We have thought of that too," she said smoothly. "We found a wonderful assisted living facility just outside the city. It is incredibly peaceful and beautiful. You will have your own private room, 24-hour medical care, and a community of people your age. It will be like a permanent vacation. You will not have to worry about cooking, cleaning, or paying bills ever again. We will cover your residency fees until you get back on your feet." An assisted living facility. They were not offering me a room in their spacious suburban home. They were planning to lock me away in a retirement home and take complete control of my life. They wanted me out of sight and out of mind so they could liquidate my assets without interference. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. I looked from Derek to Rachel, letting the silence hang in the air for a long moment. I forced tears to well up in my eyes again, allowing one to spill over and track down my wrinkled cheek. I reached out and took Derek's hand, gripping it tightly. "You are a good son, Derek," I whispered, my voice thick with fake emotion. "I do not deserve you. I am just so incredibly tired. I cannot fight this battle alone anymore. If you think this cash buyer is my best option, then I trust you. I will do whatever you think is necessary to save us from this nightmare." Derek relaxed visibly. The tension drained from his shoulders, and a genuine smile finally broke across his face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into a cage. He patted my hand confidently. "That is the spirit, Dad," he said cheerfully. "You are making the right choice. I will call the buyer first thing in the morning and get the initial paperwork drafted. We will handle all the heavy lifting. You just focus on resting and packing up your personal items. Rachel and I brought our overnight bags. We will stay in the guest room tonight and help you sort through Mom belongings tomorrow. We are not going to leave you alone in this big, empty house. I nodded, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. Thank you, I murmured. I think I just need to lie down for a while. My chest feels tight and my head is spinning. Rachel immediately stood up, playing the dutiful caretaker. Of course, William, she cooed. Let me help you to your bedroom. You need to get some sleep. We have everything completely under control. I allowed her to guide me out of the study. When my bedroom door closed behind me, my fragile posture instantly vanished. I stood straight, taking a deep, steadying breath. My mind raced with terrifying clarity. They were staying to guard their prize. I knew the truth. Exactly. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the dark ceiling for hours. The house was completely silent, but my mind was deafening. I thought about every moment of Derek growing up. I thought about the little boy who used to run through these very halls playing hide and seek. I thought about Diane and how she used to read to him every night. How did that innocent child turn into a man who could smile while plotting his own father's downfall? I tossed and turned, gripping the bedsheets until my knuckles ached. I could not sleep. The betrayal was a heavy stone sitting on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I waited for the sun to rise. I needed to see what they would do next. By 6 a.m, the first light of dawn began to creep through the heavy curtains. I sat up and quietly swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My joints were stiff, but I ignored the dull ache. I needed a glass of water to soothe my dry throat. I put on my slippers and walked out of the master suite, stepping softly onto the thick hallway runner. The guest bedroom where Derek and Rachel were staying was at the far end of the corridor. As I walked past the grand staircase, I heard a faint murmuring sound. It was coming from their room. The door was cracked open just an inch. A sliver of warm yellow light spilled out onto the dark hardwood floor. I stopped walking. I held my breath and stepped closer to the wall, pressing my back against the cold plaster. I listened intently. It was Derek. He was speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. He must have been on a phone call. His voice was muffled at first, but as I leaned in closer, the words became agonizingly clear. I am telling you, the old man took the bait completely, Derek said, his voice laced with a sickening arrogance. He is terrified. He thinks the bank is going to lock him out by Friday. Get the paperwork ready immediately. Do not delay this. We need to close this week before he has a chance to talk to any of his old business buddies. There was a pause as Derek listened to the person on the other end of the line. Then he let out a low, sharp laugh. The price is $400,000, he said confidently. No, he will not argue. I told you he is panicking. He thinks this is a miracle bailout. He will sign whatever we put in front of him. Just make sure the contract is ironclad. We cannot afford any loopholes. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. $400,000. I stood frozen in the hallway, struggling to process the magnitude of the crime my son was orchestrating. This estate was easily worth $3 million on the open market. The land alone was worth a fortune in this neighborhood. Selling it for $400,000 was not a distressed sale. It was an outright theft. Derek continued talking, pacing back and forth inside the room. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate. Rachel is keeping him distracted, he said. She is playing the sweet daughter-in-law perfectly. He thinks we are saving him from federal prison. Just wire the funds to the escrow account today and have the notary ready for tomorrow afternoon. We are going to lock this down before he even realizes what hit him. I will handle the rest. I heard the click of the phone disconnecting. Then I heard Rachel's voice, sleepy and groggy. Is everything set? She asked. Yes, Derek replied. The buyer is good to go. The old fool practically handed us the keys last night. We just need to keep up the act for one more day. I carefully stepped away from the door, terrified that the floorboards might creak and give me away. I moved like a shadow, retreating down the long corridor and slipping back into the safety of my master bedroom. I closed the door silently and locked it, locking myself in with the horrifying truth. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out over the sprawling manicured lawns of my estate. The morning dew was glittering in the early sunlight. Diane and I had planted those oak trees together 30 years ago. We had built this life from nothing, and now my own flesh and blood was trying to steal it for a fraction of its worth. But it was not just the price that bothered me. My gut instinct, honed by decades of cutthroat business negotiations, flared into a full-blown alarm. Why would Derek force me to sell a $3 million estate for $400,000 to a stranger? It made no logical sense. If he wanted to maximize his own profit, he would have tried to sell the house for market value and pocketed the difference. A cash buyer sweeping in to take an 80% discount was not a lucky coincidence. It was a setup. The buyer had to be someone he knew, someone he was working with. Perhaps the buyer was just a front, a phantom entity designed to hold the property until the dust settled. Once the house was legally out of my name, they could flip it for its true value and split the millions. I paced the length of my bedroom, my mind connecting the dots with terrifying speed. Derek was not trying to help me out of a financial hole. He was actively digging my grave. He was using my fabricated panic against me, weaponizing my supposed vulnerability to rob me blind. And Rachel was in on the entire scheme. They were a team of vultures circling a man they thought was already dead. I walked into my bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The sad, defeated old man I had played the night before was gone. Staring back at me was William Harrison, the ruthless businessman who had crushed industry rivals and built an empire with his bare hands. Derek had mistaken my fatherly love for weakness. He had mistaken my age for incompetence. He thought I was a clueless old man who would blindly sign away my life work because I was afraid of the dark. But he had forgotten who raised him. He had forgotten whose blood ran in his veins. I did not get to the top of the logistics industry by being a victim. I got there by outsmarting every person who ever tried to cross me. I wiped my face with the towel and tossed it onto the counter. I needed to act fast. I needed to gather evidence. I needed to find out exactly who this mysterious cash buyer was and what Derek was doing with his own finances. Because if he was desperate enough to steal $3 million from his own father, he was hiding a massive problem. I knew the truth. I stayed in my bedroom waiting for the house to wake up. I listened as Derek and Rachel packed their bags and moved down the grand staircase toward the kitchen. They talked in hushed tones, going over their master plan. I did not go downstairs. I could not look at my son without exposing the rage boiling inside my chest. I stayed by the window listening to them leave. The front door clicked shut. Their luxury sedan roared to life. I watched as the car backed out and sped away down the street. They were heading to the office to finalize my destruction. As soon as they disappeared, I moved. I walked straight down the hallway to my private home office. I locked the door and closed the blinds, plunging the room into shadow. I sat at my mahogany desk and booted up my computer. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I was about to dig into the company I built to find out how badly the boy I raised had betrayed me. The sadness evaporated, leaving only cold, calculated determination. I opened the encrypted portal to the company mainframe. I used my founder credentials to access the master database. I did not need to look at the entire logistics empire. I only needed to look at the regional branch here in Dallas. I pulled up the operational ledgers for the past 6 months. Everything looked perfectly normal. Revenue was steady, and operational costs appeared to be within standard margins. Derek had always been good at making things look pretty on paper. But I had been reading balance sheets since before he was born. I knew where the shadows lived. I clicked out of the main ledger and moved to the executive expense accounts. I wanted to see the corporate black card records. The black card was an unrestricted line of credit issued exclusively to top executives for emergency logistical expenditures. I gave Derek his own card 2 years ago as a sign of absolute trust. I typed the access command and hit enter. A red notification flashed across my screen. Access denied. Invalid administrative permissions. I frowned, leaning closer. I typed the command again, ensuring I had not made a typographical error. I hit enter. Access denied. My heart began to pound against my ribs. I was the founder and majority shareholder of this corporation. There was not a single digital door in this company that I did not have the key to open. The only way I could be locked out of the executive expense directory was if someone with high-level administrative clearance had manually gone into the system and revoked my access privileges. Someone who did not want me to see where the money was going. There was only one person in the Dallas branch who had the authority to alter the master permissions. Derek. He had actively locked his own father out of the financial records. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a direct number I had known by heart for over 20 years. It was the personal line for Richard Sterling, my private wealth manager and senior corporate banker at the financial institution that handled all our accounts. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "William, it is great to hear from you. I was not expecting a call today." Richard sounded genuinely pleased. I skipped the pleasantries. "Richard, I need you to pull up the corporate expense accounts for the Dallas branch right now," I said, my voice tight and authoritative. "Specifically, I need the current standing on the executive black card assigned to Derek." There was a brief pause. I heard the clatter of a keyboard as Richard accessed the files. "William, I am looking at the file now," Richard said, his tone shifting from cheerful to deeply concerned. "Is everything all right over there? I noticed some highly unusual activity a few weeks ago, but Derek assured me it was just a temporary cash flow maneuver for a new warehouse acquisition." I gripped the edge of my desk. "What exactly are you looking at, Richard? Tell me everything." Richard let out a heavy sigh. "William, the black card is completely frozen. It was flagged and suspended by our automated fraud department 10 days ago. I authorized a temporary grace period based on Derek promises, but he never followed through. The card is maxed out entirely. And that is not the worst part. There are massive unpaid overdrafts attached to the auxiliary accounts tied to that card. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have been pulled out in cash advances and directed to untraceable offshore wire transfers." I closed my eyes, absorbing the devastating blow. Untraceable offshore transfers. Cash advances. Derek was not buying warehouses. He was bleeding the company dry. "How much, Richard?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "How much is the total deficit on those accounts right now?" I heard Richard shuffling some papers on his desk. "The total unpaid balance, factoring in the overdraft penalties and the cash advance fees, is currently sitting at $750,000. And William, that does not include the standard operating capital he requested to be moved into a secondary holding account last month. I am looking at a massive financial crater here. If this does not get resolved before the quarterly audit, the board of directors will have to be notified, and the regional branch will face immediate insolvency." I thanked Richard and instructed him to keep this completely confidential before ending the call. The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place, forming a picture so ugly and terrifying it took my breath away. My son was not just a greedy and entitled brat waiting for his own father to die. He was incredibly desperate. He was drowning in massive financial ruin. $750,000 in corporate debt stolen directly from my company and funneled into the shadows. He had purposefully locked me out of the digital system just to hide the bleeding. But the quarterly audit was approaching fast. He knew that as soon as the independent auditors looked at the books, his massive theft would be exposed. He would lose his job, his reputation, and face criminal charges for embezzlement. He needed cash to cover his tracks immediately. That was exactly why he could not wait to get a fair market price for my home. He needed liquidity right now. If he tricked me into selling my estate for a miserable $400,000 to a shell company he controlled, he could quickly borrow against its true value to replace all the stolen corporate funds. He was essentially using my fabricated bankruptcy to save himself from a very real federal prison sentence. He was willing to throw me on the street to clean up his own criminal mess. I sat in the dark office, letting the reality of his monstrous plan wash over me. He genuinely thought he had me cornered without options. But he had no idea he was playing a high-stakes game against the very man who actually invented the game. I walked downstairs the next morning, leaning heavily on the oak handrail. I dragged my feet across the marble foyer, making sure every step sounded like a man carrying the weight of a broken world. Derek and Rachel were already in the kitchen. They were sitting at the island counter, drinking expensive imported coffee and laughing about a vacation they were planning. As soon as I entered the room, their laughter abruptly stopped. They snapped back into character. Derek put down his mug and stood up, adjusting his designer tie. He asked me how I had slept with a voice full of artificial concern. I let out a long, trembling sigh and told him I had barely slept a wink. I poured myself a glass of tap water, my hands shaking just enough to spill a few drops on the pristine countertop. I told them my chest felt incredibly tight, and my mind was racing with dark thoughts about the future. I said I could not handle the stress of the impending foreclosure and the loss of everything Diane and I had built. I told my son I had made an appointment to see a professional grief counselor in the city. I explained that I needed to talk to a therapist to process the absolute devastation of my financial ruin before I completely lost my mind. Rachel rushed over and placed a comforting hand on my arm. She told me she was so proud of me for seeking help, and that mental health was the most important thing right now. Derek nodded in agreement, looking thoroughly relieved. He told me to take all the time I needed at the clinic. He said he would stay at the house and finalize the preliminary paperwork with the cash buyer, so I would not have to worry about the stressful legal details. They were practically pushing me out the door. They needed the house empty, so they could measure the rooms and plan their ultimate theft in total privacy. I thanked them softly and grabbed my car keys. I walked out to the garage and got into my vehicle. I drove slowly down the long, winding driveway, keeping my head bowed. I watched them waving at me through the rearview mirror. But the moment my car turned the corner and their smiling faces disappeared from view, my entire posture changed. I straightened my back. I tightened my grip on the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The fragile, broken old man vanished into thin air. I was not going to any therapy session. I did not need to talk about my feelings. I needed to go to war. I merged onto the highway and pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator, heading straight toward the towering glass and steel skyline of downtown Dallas. The morning traffic blurred past my windows as I drove into the heart of the financial district. The towering skyscrapers reflected the glaring Texas sun. I had spent 40 years conquering this city. I knew every corporate predator, every backroom deal, and every dirty trick in the book. My son thought he could play a street game with the man who built the entire stadium. He was sorely mistaken. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek 70-story high-rise. I parked my car in an exclusive executive spot and walked directly to the private elevators. I did not stop at the reception desk. I did not need an appointment. I rode the elevator up to the penthouse floor, stepping out into the opulent lobby of the most ruthless corporate law firm in the entire state of Texas. This was the domain of Jonathan Reed. Jonathan was my personal corporate attorney, my oldest confidant, and the most vicious legal shark I had ever known. We had fought side by side in the corporate trenches for over 30 years. He was a man who destroyed rival companies for a living and dismantled hostile takeovers before breakfast. I walked past his terrified paralegals and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to his corner office. Jonathan was sitting at his massive glass desk, reviewing a stack of litigation files. When he looked up and saw the expression on my face, he immediately dropped his pen. He stood up and locked his office doors. He knew me well enough to recognize the silent fury radiating from my eyes. He poured 2 glasses of scotch and slid one across the desk. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him and took a slow, deliberate sip. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything from the very beginning. I told him about the $80 million secret sale of my logistics empire. I told him about my decision to test Derek with a fake bankruptcy story. I repeated the exact heartless words my son had said when he thought I was completely ruined. I watched Jonathan's jaw clench in anger as I explained the locked corporate black card and the $750,000 of missing funds. Finally, I told him about the mysterious cash buyer Derek had magically lined up overnight to purchase my $3 million estate for a miserable fraction of its true value. Jonathan listened in absolute silence, his sharp eyes absorbing every single detail of the monstrous betrayal. When I finally finished speaking, the heavy silence in the room was palpable. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust washing over his face. He said he had seen a lot of corporate greed in his 30-year career, but watching a son try to legally assassinate his own father was a new level of depravity. He asked me what exactly I wanted to do about it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold glass of his desk. I told him I did not just want to stop the sale. I wanted to completely dismantle Derek and his entire criminal operation. I instructed Jonathan to launch an immediate and aggressive investigation into the cash buyer my son had produced. I needed to know exactly who was controlling the escrow account. I needed to know the names, the corporate registration numbers, and the invisible banking trails connecting my son to this fraudulent transaction. I told Jonathan to deploy his best private investigators to track the missing corporate funds and uncover exactly who Derek owed that massive debt to. The pacing of our meeting accelerated into a military strategy session. Jonathan pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing down a list of aggressive countermeasures. He promised me he would have a full dossier on the fake buyer within 24 hours. We were going to follow the breadcrumbs straight into the heart of my son's darkness. Derek thought he was a mastermind, executing a flawless heist against a clueless victim. But he was about to learn that when you try to steal from the devil, you better be prepared to burn. The wheels of justice were officially in motion. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from Jonathan, listening to the steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of his sprawling corner office. Jonathan had immediately picked up his encrypted desk phone and dispatched his elite team of corporate investigators. He gave them clear and aggressive directives, demanding an expedited background check on the mysterious cash buyer Derek claimed to have found. I watched my oldest friend work with the ruthless efficiency that had made him the most feared attorney in Dallas. Once the calls were made, he poured us another glass of scotch, and we settled in to wait. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. I turned my gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering skyline. The sun was climbing higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete canyons below. I thought about the days when Derek was just a boy running through the very house he was now actively trying to steal. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the driveway, holding onto the seat of his small blue bike, and promising him I would never let him fall. I had spent my entire life building a safety net for him. Now he was using that very net to strangle me. Jonathan remained silent, giving me the space I needed to process the devastating reality of my situation. He knew better than to offer hollow words of comfort. We were men who dealt in facts, and the facts we were waiting for were bound to be ugly. Just over 2 hours later, the heavy mahogany doors of the office swung open. Jonathan, lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, walked in carrying a sleek black folder. She did not say a word. She simply placed the file squarely in the middle of the glass desk and gave Jonathan a grim, knowing nod before quietly exiting the room. Jonathan opened the folder. The silence in the room was absolute as he began to read through the neatly typed pages. I watched his eyes scan the documents, tracing the lines of ink that held the truth about my son. A dark shadow passed over Jonathan's face. His jaw tightened and he let out a low, humorless chuckle. He closed the folder and slid it across the smooth glass surface toward me. He told me to read the first page. I picked up the heavy file, my hands remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. I opened the cover and stared at the bold black letters printed at the top of the executive summary. The supposed real estate investment firm that was going to save me from federal prison was called Apex Vista Holdings. I scanned the corporate registration details. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He told me the company did not exist a month ago. Apex Vista Holdings was officially incorporated in the state of Delaware exactly 14 days ago. It was not a massive investment firm specializing in distressed properties. It was a phantom. I kept reading, my eyes moving down the page to the operational details. The company had no physical address. It had no operational history, no previous real estate transactions, and no public-facing employees. It was registered to a small, nondescript storefront in Wilmington, Delaware, that served as a mail drop for thousands of anonymous corporate entities. My son had not found a legitimate buyer. He had manufactured one. I asked Jonathan how Derek planned to purchase a $3 million estate with a shell company that had absolutely no capital. Jonathan pointed to the second page of the dossier. He explained that Delaware corporate law is notoriously secretive, allowing individuals to hide their identities behind layers of legal protection. It was the perfect place to register a company if you wanted to remain completely invisible. However, Jonathan investigators did not rely on public records. They followed the money. They tracked the initial capitalization deposit used to open the corporate bank account for Apex Vista Holdings. The trail was meticulously concealed, routed through a series of offshore holding accounts before finally landing in the United States. But a mistake had been made. The person who set up the transfer had used a personal email address as a secondary recovery contact for the routing authorization. I turned to the second page. My heart turned to a block of solid ice. The name of the primary beneficial owner of the Delaware Shell Company was printed in stark black ink. Rachel Harrison, my daughter-in-law. The sweet, innocent woman who had knelt beside my chair just hours earlier, holding a warm towel and promising me that she and Derek would take care of me. The woman who had looked me directly in the eyes and told me I would be safe in an assisted living facility. She was the sole owner of the Phantom Corporation. They were not helping me sell the house to a stranger. They were orchestrating a highly illegal heist to transfer the deed of my $3 million estate directly into their own hands. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering. They had planned to use my fabricated panic to force me into signing over the property for a miserable $400,000. Once the deed was legally transferred to Apex Vista Holdings, they would own the estate outright. They could immediately turn around and sell the property on the open market for its true $3 million value, pocketing a massive profit. Or worse, they could simply move in and live in the very house they stole from me while I rotted away in a state-run nursing home. I dropped the file heavily onto the desk. A cold, sickening wave of realization washed over me. This was not a sudden crime of opportunity. Registering a shell company in Delaware, routing offshore funds, and preparing falsified real estate contracts took weeks of careful planning. Derek and Rachel had been plotting to rob me long before I ever called them into my study with a fake bankruptcy story. My test had not planted the idea in their heads. It had merely given them the perfect excuse to execute a plan they had already set in motion. They had been waiting patiently for the exact right moment to strike. Jonathan watched me process the horrific truth. He asked me if I was all right. I looked up at my oldest friend. I told him I had never been better. The last lingering shred of parental guilt, the tiny voice in the back of my mind that wondered if I was being too harsh on my only son, completely evaporated. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were treating my life like a disposable asset. I told Jonathan we needed to dig deeper. I needed to know where Rachel got the initial funds to set up the shell company and why they were so desperate to steal my house right now. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the ugliest part was yet to be exposed. I asked Jonathan to dig deeper into the origins of the shell company. I needed to know where Rachel found the initial capital to open the corporate accounts for Apex Vista Holdings. She had never worked a day in her life, and Derek was heavily in debt. Setting up a phantom corporation and hiring a dirty notary required untraceable cash. Jonathan nodded slowly. He picked up his desk phone and instructed his forensic accounting team to trace the capitalization funds backward through the offshore routing numbers. He told me it might take a few hours to penetrate the digital firewalls, but his team was the best. We sat in the quiet office drinking our scotch and waiting for the final shoe to drop. I knew in my gut that the stolen house was only a symptom of a much larger disease. Derek was too impatient to orchestrate a complex real estate heist just to upgrade his lifestyle. He was acting like a man with a gun to his head. An hour later, the computer chimed with an urgent notification. He opened his email, and his eyes widened as he scanned the incoming encrypted report from his lead investigator. He did not say a word for a long time. He kept reading, scrolling through pages of digital banking logs and legal filings. When he finally looked up at me, the anger in his eyes had been replaced by a chilling gravity. He printed the report and slid a thick stack of papers across the glass desk. He told me to brace myself because the shell company was the least of my problems. I looked down at the first document. It was a legal filing stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. I recognized the format immediately. It was a comprehensive power of attorney agreement granting full unilateral control over my personal and corporate financial assets. I stared at the bottom of the page. My signature was printed on the dotted line. It was a flawless forgery. Every loop and angle of my handwriting had been replicated with terrifying precision. I asked Jonathan what this was. He explained that Derek had filed this forged document exactly 3 months ago. My son had walked into a notary office with a fake witness and legally stolen my identity. He had granted himself the absolute authority to act as my proxy. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. I asked Jonathan what Derek had done with this newly acquired power. Jonathan turned to the next page of the report. He pointed to a series of massive wire transfers originating from the logistics company regional branch. Derek had used the forged power of attorney to bypass the dual authentication protocols on the Corporate Emergency Reserve Fund. The Emergency Reserve Fund was the absolute lifeblood of my logistics empire. It was a restricted vault holding millions of dollars in liquid capital designed to keep the company afloat during natural disasters or catastrophic market crashes. Derek had systematically drained $2.5 million from that vault. He had broken the transfers down into smaller increments over the course of 3 weeks to avoid triggering the automated federal reporting alarms. $2.5 million had simply vanished from the corporate safety net. I gripped the armrests of my leather chair, struggling to breathe. I asked Jonathan where the money went. I needed to know what my son had bought with $2.5 million of stolen corporate capital. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me Derek did not buy anything. He gambled it away. Jonathan explained that the forensic accountants had tracked the stolen reserve funds to a series of unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. Derek had been playing the digital margin markets using highly leveraged positions to chase massive overnight profits. It was a fool game, and my son had lost spectacularly. A sudden market crash 6 weeks ago had triggered a chain reaction of margin calls, completely wiping out the $2.5 million in a matter of hours. The money was gone, vaporized in the digital ether. But the story did not end there. Jonathan turned to the final page of the report. When Derek lost the corporate funds, he panicked. He knew the annual independent audit was coming up at the end of the month. As soon as the auditors opened the books, they would immediately spot the missing $2.5 million. Derek would be exposed as an embezzler. To cover up the massive hole in the ledger before the auditors arrived, Derek did the most desperate and dangerous thing a man could do. He borrowed money from the wrong people. The private investigators had intercepted a series of encrypted messages between Derek and a violent loan shark syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. Derek had borrowed a staggering amount of cash from the syndicate at predatory interest rates, promising to pay them back with a massive return within 30 days. He used the borrowed money to temporarily plug the hole in the corporate reserve fund, hiding his initial theft from the internal accountants. But now the 30 days were almost up. The loan sharks were demanding their money back. And these were not bankers who sent polite collection letters. These were criminals who broke legs and threatened families when they did not get paid on time. The entire monstrous puzzle finally clicked into place. The horrific truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Derek was not stealing my $3 million estate just to get rich. He was stealing it because he was terrified for his own life. He needed $2.5 million in clean, untraceable cash to pay back a violent criminal syndicate before the end of the week. If he failed, the loan sharks would come for him. If he got caught by the auditors, he would go to federal prison. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. And instead of coming to me for help, instead of confessing his sins and asking his father to save him, he chose to sacrifice me to save himself. The fake bankruptcy story I had told him the night before was the perfect miracle he had been praying for. He saw a golden opportunity to trick a panicked old man into signing over a massive estate for a fraction of its value. Once the phantom company legally owned my home, they could immediately take out a massive collateral loan against the entire property. They would use that loan to pay off the dangerous syndicate and secretly replenish the corporate reserve fund before the audit. They would walk away completely clean, leaving me trapped with nothing. My own flesh and blood was perfectly willing to completely destroy my life to cover his pathetic gambling losses. I sat in the silence of the corner office looking at the forged documents scattered across the glass desk. The sadness I felt earlier was entirely gone forever. I told Jonathan to start preparing our absolute ultimate final trap. Legal documents were damning, but paper trails could be tied up in court for years. Derek could claim his signature was forged by an accountant. Rachel could claim identity theft regarding the shell company. Defense attorneys lived for creating reasonable doubt. I needed something far more visceral. I needed the undeniable sound of my own son confessing to the monstrous scheme. Jonathan opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a small black velvet box. Inside was a voice-activated recording device. It was no larger than a coin designed for corporate espionage and completely undetectable. It had a battery life of 48 hours and transmitted a live encrypted audio feed to a secure application on my phone. I took the device and rolled it between my fingers, feeling the cold metal against my skin. It felt like the final nail in my son coffin. I thanked Jonathan and left the office building, stepping out into the sweltering Texas heat. I drove to my estate and gathered heavy leather-bound family photo albums from the attic. They were filled with pictures of Derek growing up. Pictures of him blowing out birthday candles, riding his first bicycle, and standing proudly next to Diane. It was the perfect prop for a broken old man clinging desperately to the past. I loaded the albums into the passenger seat and drove across town toward the affluent suburban neighborhood where Derek and Rachel lived. Their house was a sprawling modern architectural marvel, built with floor-to-ceiling glass walls and pristine landscaping. It was a monument to their unchecked vanity. Every brick had been paid for by the massive salary I provided him and the generous loans I had forgiven. Now I knew it was also funded by stolen corporate capital and laundered money. I parked in their expansive driveway, taking a deep, steadying breath before stepping out. I gripped the heavy photo albums to my chest and walked slowly up the stone pathway toward the massive front door. I rang the bell and waited, my heart steady and cold. Rachel opened the door a few moments later. She wore a flawless silk blouse and expensive designer jewelry, looking like a woman without a care in the world. When she saw me standing on her porch, holding the photo albums, her eyes softened with a perfectly rehearsed look of pity. She ushered me inside, taking the heavy books from my arms and setting them gently on the foyer console table. She told me it was good to see me and asked how I was holding up after my therapy session. I kept my posture stooped, letting my voice waver just enough to sell the illusion. I told her the session was incredibly difficult and that the painful reality of losing the family estate was finally setting in. I said I wanted to drop off the albums so they would be safe during the moving process. Rachel placed a comforting hand on my back and guided me toward the massive kitchen. She said she was going to make me a cup of coffee to calm my nerves. She gestured toward the formal dining room, asking me to take a seat. I walked slowly into the formal dining room. It was a vast space dominated by a custom mahogany dining table. The room was decorated with expensive modern art and imported vases. I pulled out a heavy velvet chair and sat down near the head of the table. From where I sat, I had a clear view of the living room and the home office down the hall. The door to the office was wide open. I could see Derek pacing back and forth like a trapped animal. He was holding his phone tightly to his ear, speaking in rapid, furious whispers. He looked incredibly stressed, running his free hand through his hair and staring blankly at the floor. He was likely dealing with the loan sharks demanding their payment or coordinating the fraudulent real estate documents. Rachel turned her back to me and began grinding coffee beans, the loud noise of the espresso machine filling the kitchen. Derek was completely absorbed in his desperate phone call, his back turned toward the dining room. I was completely alone in the center of their home. The window of opportunity was incredibly narrow. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and pulled out the tiny recording device. My hands did not shake at all. My breathing was perfectly even. I slid my hand slowly under the thick wooden lip of the mahogany dining table. I felt around blindly until my fingers brushed against a small, recessed groove near the center joint. It was the perfect acoustic location to capture every word spoken in the room. I pressed the device firmly against the wood, feeling the industrial adhesive grip the surface securely. I pulled my empty hand back and placed it neatly on my lap just as the espresso machine wound down to a halt. Rachel turned around, carrying 2 steaming ceramic mugs on a silver tray. She walked into the dining room, completely oblivious to the digital spy now resting just inches away from her. She set the coffee down with a warm smile, telling me Derek would be out in a minute. She said he was dealing with the final banking details for the cash buyer, and everything was moving along perfectly. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee. I looked at her and thanked her for helping me through this crisis. Derek emerged from his office a few moments later. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn, but he forced a bright smile the second he saw me. He clapped me on the shoulder, telling me the buyer had formally agreed to our terms and that the closing documents would be ready for my signature tomorrow afternoon. He said my worries were about to disappear forever. I looked up at the son I had raised and told him I was incredibly proud of the man he had become. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but I swallowed it down easily. I finished my coffee and told them I needed to pack my belongings. They walked me to the front door, linking their arms like a loving couple. They watched me walk down the driveway and get into my car, waving goodbye as I backed out into the street. I drove exactly 2 blocks away and pulled my car into the deep shadows of a quiet cul-de-sac. I turned off the engine and rolled up the windows. I pulled out my phone, connecting my wireless earpiece. I opened the secure encrypted application and tapped the screen to activate the live audio feed. The connection initialized with a faint hum before clearing into crisp sound. I leaned back against the leather headrest and waited in the silence of my car. I was about to hear exactly how far my own flesh and blood was truly willing to go. I leaned back against the leather headrest and waited in the silence of my car. I was about to hear exactly how far my own flesh and blood was truly willing to go. The street outside was completely empty, bathed in the pale orange glow of the streetlights. A heavy Texas humidity clung to the windshield, but the air conditioning inside the cabin kept me completely numb. I stared blindly at the digital dashboard display, watching the green audio wave fluctuate on my phone screen. For the first few minutes, there was nothing but the ambient noise of their house. I heard the faint clinking of silverware against porcelain plates. I heard a chair scrape against the hardwood floor. They were sitting down at the massive mahogany table to eat their dinner. I closed my eyes, visualizing the exact layout of the room. The tiny transmitter I had planted was positioned perfectly, picking up every subtle shift in the environment. I heard the pop of a wine bottle opening and the splash of liquid being poured into crystal glasses. They were celebrating. They were toasting to their impending wealth and my ultimate destruction. I gripped the steering wheel, letting the cold reality wash over me. It is a profoundly disturbing experience to eavesdrop on the people you love. You prepare yourself for the worst, but hearing the casual domesticity of their evil is entirely different. They were not screaming or fighting. They were simply having dinner, making polite conversation, while plotting to steal my $3 million estate. The clinking of silverware slowed down. Rachel was the first one to break the comfortable silence. Her voice came through the earpiece sharp and laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of anxiety. She asked Derek if he had reviewed the final draft of the real estate transfer documents that the lawyer had sent over. I heard Derek take a slow sip of his wine before answering. He told her everything was perfectly in order and that the dirty notary was locked in for tomorrow afternoon. He said the deed transfer was ironclad and that Apex Vista Holdings would officially own the property by sunset. There was a brief pause. I heard Rachel let out a long, trembling sigh. Her high heels clicked nervously against the floor underneath the table right next to the hidden microphone. She told Derek she was incredibly worried about the actual signing process. She reminded him that I had spent 40 years negotiating brutal logistics contracts and analyzing complex financial ledgers. She said I was a man who read the fine print on every single document I had ever signed. Her voice pitched higher as her panic began to bleed through. "What if he actually reads the contract tomorrow, Derek?" She asked, her words echoing loudly in my silent car. "What if he looks down at the purchase agreement and clearly sees the $400,000 figure printed on the page? He is old, Derek, but he is not stupid. If he sees that number, he will know it is a scam. He will immediately realize the house is worth $3 million, and he will refuse to sign." I sat in the dark, gripping the edge of my seat. Rachel was absolutely right. The entire premise of their heist relied heavily on my fabricated state of panic, but even a desperate man would pause at an 80% discount. A normal person facing bankruptcy would demand to put the house on the open market to salvage whatever equity remained. They were depending entirely on the illusion that I was too exhausted and broken to read the paperwork. Rachel understood the massive risk they were taking. She knew that if I hesitated for even a single second, the entire illusion would shatter. I heard her chair scrape backward as she stood up, pacing nervously across the dining room floor. She told Derek that if I refused to sign the contract, the loan sharks would come looking for their $2.5 million by the end of the week. She said they would lose their house, their cars, and their freedom. She was terrified. She was practically begging him to reassure her that the plan was foolproof. Hearing the raw terror in her voice gave me a brief, fleeting sense of satisfaction. They were drowning in the stress of their own criminal conspiracy. But that satisfaction was immediately crushed by the sheer weight of the betrayal. This was the woman who had hugged me at the front door just an hour ago. This was the woman who had poured me coffee and smiled with synthetic warmth, telling me that everything was going to be all right. Now she was pacing in her dining room, terrified that her plot to rob a grieving widower might actually fall apart. The tension in my car spiked dramatically as I waited for my son to respond. I needed to hear how he planned to force my hand. I needed to know what dark, manipulative tactic he was going to deploy to ensure I blindly signed over the deed to my home. The green audio wave on my phone screen flattened out into a straight line as a heavy silence fell over their dining room. I heard the distinct sound of Derek setting his wine glass down on the mahogany table. The clink of the crystal rang out like a gunshot through my earpiece. When he finally spoke, his tone was remarkably calm. It was not the voice of a desperate man trying to soothe his panicked wife. It was the cold, detached voice of a predator who had already cornered his prey. He told Rachel to sit down and stop pacing. He told her she was acting completely hysterical over a problem that did not exist. I pressed the earpiece deeper into my ear, straining to catch every single syllable. My breathing slowed to a shallow rhythm. Derek let out a low, patronizing chuckle. He told his wife that she was giving me far too much credit. He said that the man I used to be, the ruthless corporate titan who built an empire, was dead and buried. He told her I was nothing more than a pathetic, frightened old man who was begging for a lifeline. But Rachel was not convinced. She pushed back, her voice trembling with frustration. She told Derek that fear did not erase 40 years of business instincts. She insisted that if I saw the $400,000 purchase price printed on the closing documents, I would immediately call my lawyer. I sat in the darkness of my car, nodding in agreement with my deceitful daughter-in-law. She was the only one in that house who truly understood the massive danger they were in. Derek let out a long, exasperated sigh. He told Rachel to listen to him very carefully. He explained that he was never going to rely purely on my emotional distress. He told her he had developed a foolproof contingency plan. The absolute certainty in his voice sent a violent shiver down my spine. I braced myself for his next terrible words. The silence stretching through my earpiece felt heavier than the stifling Texas heat pressing against the windows of my car. I sat completely still in the dark cul-de-sac, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers began to ache. I could hear the faint sound of Rachel breathing on the other end of the transmitter. She was waiting for her husband to explain his grand solution to the massive problem she had just pointed out. I was waiting too. I stared at the green audio waves fluctuating on the illuminated screen of my cell phone, watching the digital representation of my son betraying me unfold in real time. The street outside remained completely deserted. There was no one around to witness the exact moment my heart finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the headrest, preparing my mind for whatever corporate manipulation or legal trickery Derek had devised to force my signature. But I was entirely unprepared for the sheer depth of the malice he was about to unleash. Derek did not just want to trick me. He wanted to completely strip away my free will. Derek's voice finally broke the suffocating tension in their dining room. His tone was smooth and unnervingly calm, echoing through my earpiece with the casual confidence of a man discussing the weather rather than the destruction of his own father. He told Rachel to stop underestimating his intelligence. He said he had been planning this financial extraction for weeks, and he was never going to leave a $3 million real estate transaction to the unpredictable whims of an old man's emotions. He explained that human panic was a useful tool, but it was far too volatile to rely on when dealing with ironclad legal contracts. He knew my 40 years of corporate experience would eventually override my fabricated grief. He knew I would demand to read the fine print. So he decided to completely remove my ability to read anything at all. I heard him take another slow sip of his wine, the crystal glass clinking softly against the mahogany table. He told his wife that he had already taken care of the variable. He had neutralized my mind. Rachel sounded confused. She asked him what he meant by neutralizing my mind. Her voice trembled slightly, as if she was suddenly realizing that she had married a monster. Derek let out a low, patronizing sigh. He told her to think about my daily morning routine. He reminded her that I was 70 years old, and like clockwork, I took a mild prescription medication for my blood pressure every single day before breakfast. He said he had been watching me carefully for the past 2 days, noting exactly where I kept the small orange pill bottles in the master bathroom cabinet. My blood turned to absolute ice. I remembered Derek wandering down the upstairs hallway this morning while I was pretending to be overwhelmed with grief in the kitchen. I had assumed he was just looking for a spare towel or checking the guest room, but he was actually invading my private sanctuary. He was hunting through my medicine cabinet. I sat frozen in my vehicle, listening to my son proudly confess to tampering with his own father's prescription medication. Derek continued his horrifying explanation, detailing the meticulous nature of his premeditated crime. He told Rachel that he had spent hours browsing unregulated pharmaceutical forums online a few weeks ago. He had intentionally sought out a specific type of heavy industrial-grade sedative. He bragged about finding a supplier who dealt in powerful tranquilizers, normally reserved for severe psychiatric patients or intense surgical preparations. The drugs were colorless, odorless, and completely devastating to the human central nervous system. He proudly informed his wife that the sedatives were specifically designed to induce a state of extreme cognitive compliance and severe lethargy. He said he had received the discreet package in the mail 2 days ago. And this morning, while I was standing in the kitchen telling them I needed to see a grief counselor, Derek had slipped into my bathroom. He had emptied my blood pressure capsules and carefully refilled them with the crushed psychiatric sedatives. He had literally poisoned my daily medication while sleeping under my roof. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Rachel. Her chair scraped backward against the hardwood floor as the shocking reality of his actions finally hit her. She asked him if he was insane. She asked what would happen if the dosage was too high and he accidentally triggered a fatal heart attack. Derek simply laughed. The sound of his laughter was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard in my entire life. He told her a heart attack would just speed up the inheritance process anyway, but he had measured the dosage perfectly. He assured her that the amount he had slipped into my pills was just enough to turn my brain to absolute mush. He told her that by the time their bribed notary and the shady lawyer arrived at my estate tomorrow at noon, I would be completely incapacitated. He said I would be awake but entirely unaware of my surroundings. I would not be able to read the $400,000 figure on the closing documents. I would not be able to ask questions. I would simply sit in my armchair staring blankly at the wall and sign whatever piece of paper he placed directly into my trembling hands. A wave of profound physical sickness washed over me. I opened the door of my car and leaned out over the asphalt, gasping for air. The humid Texas night offered no relief. My stomach heaved violently as the sheer horror of the situation crashed down upon me. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had carried home from the hospital, the boy I had protected and provided for, had actively poisoned me. He had weaponized my age and my health to orchestrate a massive financial heist. He had calmly measured out a dose of illegal tranquilizers and watched me walk around my house knowing a chemical time bomb was waiting in my medicine cabinet. If I had actually taken my pills this morning instead of throwing them away to rush to my lawyer, I would currently be slipping into a drug-induced stupor. I would be lying in my bed right now completely vulnerable while my son prepared to rob me blind. The betrayal had crossed the line from a desperate financial crime into a cold-blooded physical assault. I pulled myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door. My hands trembled so violently, I barely held my phone. I stared at the green audio waves dancing across the screen. I listened to Rachel transition from shock to greedy acceptance. She asked Derek how long the sedatives would last, ensuring the drug would not wear off before the contract was signed. Derek told her the chemicals would keep me completely docile for at least 24 hours. He said the timing was perfect and nothing could possibly fail, but Rachel still sounded unconvinced. Her voice carried a sharp edge of panic that cut right through the static of my earpiece. She asked Derek what would happen when the 24 hours were up. She wanted to know what would happen when the heavy tranquilizers finally wore off, and I woke up in an empty room. She told her husband that I would immediately realize my house had been stolen. I would realize that the $400,000 was a complete sham, and that my own son had poisoned me to steal my entire estate. She said I would march straight to the police station and file a massive lawsuit against both of them. She paced across the dining room floor, her heels clicking rapidly. She told him that taking my money was one thing, but drugging me was a serious felony. She said I would never stop hunting them down, and that I had the resources and the intelligence to put them both behind bars for the rest of their lives. I waited in the dark silence of my car, holding my breath. I wanted to hear how Derek planned to survive the inevitable aftermath of his crime. I wanted to know if he genuinely thought I would just quietly accept my destruction and fade away into the shadows. The response I heard next was the most chilling sound I have ever experienced. Derek laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or a forced chuckle to calm his wife. It was a deep, genuine laugh of pure amusement. It was the sound of a predator who had completely outsmarted his prey. He told Rachel she was worrying about a future that was never going to happen. He said I was never going to walk into a police station. I was never going to call a lawyer. I was never going to file a lawsuit because I was never going to be a free man again. Rachel stopped pacing. The heavy silence in their dining room returned. She asked him what he meant by that. She asked if he was planning to hurt me physically. Derek scoffed at the question, telling her he was not a murderer. He said he was a strategist, and his strategy covered every single variable. He explained that when he went to the notary 3 months ago to forge the financial documents, he did not just sign a standard power of attorney. He also forged a comprehensive medical power of attorney. He had granted himself absolute legal authority over my healthcare decisions, my medical treatments, and my physical living arrangements. He told Rachel that document was the ultimate trump card in his grand design. He laid out the final phase of his monstrous plan with the cold precision of a military general. He said that tomorrow afternoon, as soon as the ink was completely dry on the real estate transfer, he was going to pick up his cell phone and call emergency services. He was going to tell the dispatcher that his elderly father had just suffered a massive psychological collapse. He would tell the paramedics that the crushing weight of my sudden financial bankruptcy had completely broken my mind. He would say that I was hallucinating, that I was behaving erratically, and that I posed a severe danger to myself and to others around me. He told Rachel the heavy sedatives flowing through my bloodstream would perfectly mimic the physical symptoms of a severe nervous breakdown. I would be groggy, disoriented, unable to speak clearly and completely stripped of my usual commanding presence. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics would see a fragile, confused old man mumbling incoherently. They would check my vitals and see my heart rate slowed by the industrial tranquilizers. Derek would stand there playing the role of the devastated but responsible son. He would hand the emergency medical technicians the forged medical power of attorney. He would instruct them to transport me immediately to a state-run psychiatric facility on the outskirts of the city. He proudly told his wife that he had already selected the exact hospital. It was a bleak, underfunded government ward, designed for patients who had absolutely no one left to advocate for them. It was a place where people went to be forgotten by the rest of the world. Rachel asked him if the doctors at the hospital would realize I was perfectly sane once the drugs finally wore off. Derek laughed again, telling her that sanity was a highly subjective concept when you were locked inside a padded room. He explained that once I was admitted to the psychiatric ward, he would use his legal authority to place a strict communication ban on my file. I would not be allowed to make any telephone calls. I would not be allowed to access a computer or send any emails. I would be permitted 0 visitors except for him and Rachel. If I tried to tell the hospital staff that my son had stolen my $3 million estate and poisoned my medication, the doctors would simply write it down as a symptom of my severe dementia. They would document my claims as the paranoid delusions of a bankrupt man who could not accept his own tragic reality. He said the more I fought, the more I protested my innocence, the crazier I would look to the medical professionals. They would strap me to a hospital bed and pump me full of real antipsychotic drugs to keep me manageable. I would spend the rest of my natural life trapped behind locked steel doors, surrounded by strangers staring out of a barred window. I would be completely erased from society. My entire legacy, my business, my wealth, and my identity would belong to him. I would simply become a tragic, cautionary tale about a successful businessman who lost his fortune and his mind in his twilight years. He told Rachel they would be completely free to enjoy their new millions without ever looking over their shoulders. I sat inside my dark car, listening to the final details of my own living funeral. The air inside the cabin felt completely devoid of oxygen. I stared at the dashboard, my hands resting limply on my lap. The sheer magnitude of the evil I had just witnessed was impossible to process all at once. My son did not just want to rob me of my wealth. He wanted to strip away my fundamental human dignity. He wanted to bury me alive in a sterile white room and leave me to rot until the day I died. A profound, freezing numbness spread through my veins. The sorrow, the grief, the lingering paternal love I had desperately clung to vanished into the humid Texas night. It was replaced by an absolute, blinding wrath. I reached forward and slowly turned off the audio receiver. I unplugged the earpiece and placed it carefully into the center console. I started the engine of my vehicle. The soft hum of the motor grounded me, pulling my mind back into sharp focus. Derek believed he had designed an inescapable labyrinth, taking all the keys away, but he was wrong. He had not taken all the keys. He had simply handed me the exact blueprint to his own destruction. I sat in the darkness of my vehicle for another hour, letting the horrific reality of the recording settle deep into my bones. The sorrow that had been weighing down my heart completely burned away. The grief of a father mourning his lost son evaporated into the humid night air, leaving absolutely nothing behind but pure, calculating wrath. I was no longer a victim. I was a predator who had just been given the scent of blood. I started the engine and drove back to my massive estate, slipping quietly through the front door and retreating to my master suite. I did not sleep. I spent the rest of the night pacing across the hardwood floor, mentally reviewing every single step of the counterattack Jonathan and I had designed. I needed to execute my role with absolute flawless precision. If Derek wanted to play a high-stakes game of psychological warfare, I was going to give him a masterclass. The sun finally rose, casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawns of my property. I walked into my sprawling master bathroom and stared at the orange prescription bottles lined up perfectly on the marble counter. I picked up the bottle of blood pressure medication. I shook it gently, listening to the faint rattle of the pills inside. Derek had been in here. He had opened this bottle and laced it with heavy industrial sedatives designed to turn my mind to mush. I felt a fresh wave of disgust wash over me, but I forced my face into a mask of frail exhaustion. I opened the bottle and tipped one of the tainted capsules into the palm of my hand. I wrapped it tightly in a small tissue and shoved it deep into the pocket of my trousers. I walked downstairs to the kitchen where Derek and Rachel were already sitting at the island counter. They were dressed in immaculate designer clothing, looking like they were preparing for a celebration rather than a funeral. Derek smiled warmly when he saw me walking into the room. He asked me how I was feeling today. I let out a long, trembling sigh and told him my chest still felt incredibly tight. I poured myself a glass of water and pulled a harmless vitamin capsule from my pocket, making sure to keep it perfectly concealed within my palm. I raised my hand to my mouth, tossing the vitamin inside and taking a large gulp of water. Derek watched me intently, his eyes fixed on my throat as I swallowed. He thought I was taking the heavy sedative. He thought he was watching the poison enter my bloodstream. I wiped my mouth with a napkin and offered him a weak, grateful smile. I told him I was just so glad he was here to help me handle this terrible financial burden. He patted my shoulder affectionately, telling me the buyer would be here at noon and everything would be resolved. Over the next hour, I began to carefully perform the physical symptoms of severe cognitive impairment. I let my sentences trail off into confused silence. I stumbled slightly as I walked down the hallway, bracing myself against the walls for support. I blinked sluggishly, rubbing my eyes and complaining that the room felt like it was spinning. Rachel brought me a cup of hot tea, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. She guided me gently into the heavy leather armchair in my study, telling me to just relax until the lawyers arrived. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, and letting my breathing slow to a deep, lethargic rhythm. Derek and Rachel whispered to each other in the corner of the room, practically giddy with their impending victory. They thought I was slipping into a deep chemical fog. They thought my mind was shutting down exactly as they had planned. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. While I sat motionless in the leather armchair, pretending to be a heavily sedated victim, the real machinery of my vengeance was operating flawlessly in the background. Miles away in the heart of downtown Dallas, my ruthless corporate attorney, Jonathan Reed, was executing the most critical phase of our trap. At exactly 9 a.m, Jonathan filed an expedited emergency legal petition with the county clerk office. He utilized a rare loophole in Texas property law designed for immediate familial asset protection. With a few swift keystrokes and the power of his massive legal firm, Jonathan completely severed my legal connection to the $3 million estate. He executed an irrevocable quitclaim deed, transferring the absolute ownership of the property directly to my daughter Natalie, who lived safely across the country in Seattle. The transfer was instantaneous and completely unassailable. Natalie was completely unaware of the raging war, but she was now the sole legal proprietor of the massive Dallas estate. I no longer owned the house. I no longer had the legal authority to sell the property, even if I wanted to. The entire premise of Derek's fraudulent scheme had been completely eradicated without him even knowing it. The phantom shell company Rachel had registered in Delaware was preparing to purchase a house from a man who did not own it. If Derek forced me to sign that real estate contract today, he would not be finalizing a clever loophole. He would be committing a massive documented federal crime. He would be attempting to defraud an innocent third party while utilizing forged documents and stolen corporate identities. Jonathan had woven a legal noose so tight that my son would never be able to slip out of it. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been swallowed whole and the steel jaws were waiting to snap shut. I kept my eyes closed, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of my study. It was 11:30 in the morning. Only 30 minutes remained until the highly orchestrated signing was scheduled to take place. I could hear the faint rustling of paper as Derek organized the massive stack of fraudulent contracts on my desk. He was humming a quiet, cheerful tune under his breath. The sheer arrogance of his demeanor was astounding. He truly believed he had outsmarted the man who taught him everything he knew. Rachel was standing near the window looking out at the long, winding driveway. I heard her whisper to Derek that the private medical transport had just arrived. The customized ambulance they had hired to forcefully commit me to the state-run psychiatric ward was idling silently by the curb. They were preparing to erase my entire existence the moment my signature hit the paper. I felt a slow, deliberate calm wash over my entire body. I was surrounded by traitors sitting in a meticulously designed nightmare, yet I felt absolutely no fear. I shifted slightly, letting out a soft, painful groan. Derek walked over, casting a shadow. He leaned down, whispering softly, "It is almost time now, Dad." I let my head loll, acting as if his words were swimming through a cognitive fog. I blinked heavily, forcing my eyelids to flutter, as though staying awake was burning through my last reserves of energy. Derek stood over me with absolute triumph painted across his face. He reached down and gripped my arm, pulling me upward with an impatient tug. I allowed my legs to buckle slightly, leaning my body weight against his shoulder. He steered me toward the massive oak desk in the center of my study. Rachel was waiting by the doorway, holding a thick leather briefcase. Standing right behind her was a short, balding man wearing a cheap gray suit and carrying a portable stamping kit. This was the bribed notary Derek had arranged. The man who was willing to ignore a heavily drugged senior citizen and illegally certify a fraudulent real estate transfer for a cut of the stolen money. The man kept his head down, avoiding eye contact as he scurried into the room and arranged his documents on my desk. Rachel pulled out my heavy desk chair. She patted the leather seat, urging me to sit down with a sickeningly sweet voice. I shuffled forward and collapsed into the chair, letting my chin rest near my chest. I stared blankly at the polished mahogany surface, watching as the notary pulled a massive stack of papers from his briefcase. It was the 50-page contract that would supposedly save me from federal prison. It was the document that would transfer the deed of my estate to Rachel Phantom Shell Company in Delaware. The notary spread the pages out, aligning them perfectly in front of me. He pulled a heavy brass pen from his pocket and placed it next to the signature line. Derek stepped up to the edge of the desk, blocking my view of the room. He leaned over, resting his hands flat on the paperwork to ensure I could not flip through the pages. He was making sure I could not see the miserable $400,000 purchase price printed on the second sheet. I let out a low, confused groan, rubbing my temples with trembling fingers. I asked what these papers were, acting as though I had forgotten our conversation. Derek smiled a predatory smile. The mask of the loving son was gone, replaced by the ruthless ambition of a cornered criminal. He told me not to worry about the legal jargon. He said these were just the standard closing documents for the cash buyer we discussed. He spoke to me slowly, using the condescending tone people use when talking to a confused toddler. He told me the bank was calling non-stop and that we needed to finalize this transfer right now before the foreclosure agents showed up. Rachel stepped up behind my chair, resting her hands on my shoulders. She leaned down, whispering in my ear that everything was going to be all right. She said the assisted living facility had prepared a beautiful room for me and that I would be safe there. The sheer audacity of her lies made my blood run cold. They were standing in the house I had built, orchestrating my total destruction while pretending to be my saviors. I let my head sag forward, staring at the heavy brass pen resting on the contract. I moved my hand sluggishly, letting my fingers brush the metal. As I shifted my weight in the chair, my gaze drifted past Derek toward the large bay windows overlooking the front lawn. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled back just enough to reveal the long, winding driveway. Parked idling quietly by the iron front gates was a stark white private medical transport vehicle. It was a custom ambulance equipped with barred windows and heavily tinted glass. Two large men wearing dark blue paramedic uniforms were standing by the rear doors, smoking cigarettes and looking toward my house. My stomach twisted violently. Derek had not been bluffing on the audio recording. He had truly arranged for a specialized psychiatric transport team to wait outside while I signed away my life. They were waiting for the signal. The moment my signature hit the dotted line, Derek was going to call them inside. They would strap me to a stretcher, inject me with chemical restraints, and haul me away to a state-run asylum. I would be locked in a padded room with no communication and no way to prove my own sanity. I stared at the idling ambulance, letting the horrific reality of my son's absolute malice burn itself permanently into my mind. I was looking at my own hearse. Derek noticed my gaze drifting toward the window. He shifted his body to block my line of sight, stepping directly into my field of vision. He tapped his index finger sharply against the signature line on the contract. He told me to focus on the paperwork. His voice was losing its artificial warmth, replaced by a sharp, commanding edge. He said the buyer was getting impatient, and we needed to get this done right now. I looked up at him, allowing my eyes to appear vacant. I mumbled a quiet apology, telling him my head was pounding, and I could barely read the words on the page. I asked him if we could wait a few hours so I could rest my eyes. Rachel tightened her grip on my shoulders, her fingernails digging into my skin. She told me we could not wait another minute. She said the bank was going to freeze my accounts by 1 o'clock, and I had to sign the papers immediately. The notary shifted nervously from foot to foot, wiping sweat from his forehead. He knew this was highly illegal, and the tension in the room was making him panic. He wanted his bribe money to escape. Derek picked up the brass pen and forced it into my trembling hand. He wrapped his fingers around mine, guiding the tip down toward the bottom of the page. He looked me directly in the eyes, his gaze cold and dead. "Just sign here, Dad," he whispered, his tone dripping with venomous anticipation. "Just put your name on the line and it will all be over soon. I promise you will never have to worry about this house ever again." I held the pen loosely, letting it wobble against the parchment. I stared at the dotted line. This was the exact moment Derek had been dreaming of for weeks. This was the culmination of his criminal design. He thought he had outsmarted the ruthless corporate titan who built an empire. He thought his sedatives had erased my free will. He was so consumed by arrogance and desperation that he failed to notice the subtle shift in my breathing. He failed to notice that my hand was no longer shaking. I sat in the heavy leather chair surrounded by traitors, holding the very instrument of my destruction. I took one slow breath, savoring the last remaining seconds of his fleeting victory. I looked at the pen, and then I looked back up at the boy I had raised. I held the heavy brass pen, letting the polished metal catch the light from the study window. I allowed it to hover just an inch above the crisp white paper of the fraudulent real estate contract. Derek was standing close to me. I could hear the shallow, nervous rhythm of his breathing. He shifted his weight impatiently, tapping his expensive shoe against the hardwood floor. He was desperate for the ink to flow. He needed that signature to wipe away his massive embezzlement, to satisfy the violent loan sharks, and lock me away. Rachel stepped closer, her perfume thick in the stagnant air. She whispered for me to go ahead and sign, telling me the ambulance was waiting to take me home. The bribed notary stood silently clutching his briefcase, his eyes darting toward the door. I looked at the heavy brass pen suspended directly over the blank dotted line on the paper. This was the precipice. This was the boundary between the father who had unconditionally loved his son and the ruthless businessman who was about to destroy a traitor. I opened my fingers. The brass pen slipped from my grasp. It hit the desk with a sharp clatter and rolled away, coming to a complete stop against the contract. Derek let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. He reached across the desk to grab the pen, assuming my drugged mind had simply forgotten what to do. But before his fingers could touch the cylinder, my entire physical posture changed. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The frail, stooped slump of my shoulders corrected itself as I sat up perfectly straight in my chair. I lifted my head. The vacant, cloudy haze that I had been projecting all morning cleared from my eyes like smoke dissipating in the wind. I looked directly into my son's eyes. The expression I gave him was not the confused stare of a sedated victim. It was the sharp, piercing glare of an apex predator. I smiled at him. It was a cold, calculating, and utterly merciless smile. Derek froze. His hand hovered mid-air above the desk. His brow furrowed in deep confusion as his brain struggled to process the sudden, impossible shift in my demeanor. He stared at my clear, focused eyes, searching for any sign of the powerful psychiatric tranquilizers he had slipped into my medication. He could not understand why I was not slumping forward. He could not comprehend how the heavy industrial sedatives had failed to turn my mind to mush. Rachel noticed the sudden silence. She stepped out from behind my chair, her expensive high heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. She asked Derek what was wrong, her voice laced with anxiety. Derek did not answer her. He kept his eyes locked on mine, a creeping sense of primal dread beginning to wash over his features. He finally found his voice stammering slightly as he told me to pick the pen back up and finish signing the paperwork. He tried to project authority, but his tone was brittle and hollow. I did not break eye contact. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I told him in a perfectly steady, commanding voice that I was not going to sign a single page. I told him the sale was canceled. Before Derek could even open his mouth to argue, the heavy double doors of my study swung violently open. The loud crash of the heavy wood hitting the wall sent a shockwave through the room. Derek spun around, gasping in shock. Rachel let out a startled shriek, stumbling backward and clutching her chest. The bribed notary dropped his briefcase entirely, letting it crash onto the hardwood floor. Standing squarely in the doorway was Jonathan Reed. My ruthless corporate attorney looked like an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, his expression completely devoid of any mercy. He held a thick leather folder tucked under his arm, and his eyes locked immediately onto my son. But Jonathan did not walk into the room alone. Stepping through the doorway right behind him were three tall, broad-shouldered men. They moved with absolute tactical precision, fanning out across the threshold and completely blocking the only exit from the study. They were not private security guards. They were definitely not standard local police officers. They were federal agents. They wore dark tactical pants and navy blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI printed boldly across their chests. The lead agent, a stern man with a clipped haircut and a silver badge clipped to his belt, stepped forward into the center of the room. He rested his hand casually near the holster on his hip, his gaze sweeping over the fraudulent contracts scattered across my desk. The atmosphere inside the study shattered completely. The arrogant confidence that had been radiating from Derek just moments ago evaporated into pure, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of pale ash. He took a long, stumbling step backward violently, bumping into the sharp edge of the mahogany desk. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked from Jonathan to the federal agents and back to me. The realization of what was actually happening began to dawn on him. He realized that the heavy sedatives had never entered my system. He realized that his airtight criminal conspiracy had been completely compromised. Rachel was hyperventilating, her back pressed flat against the bookshelves. She looked wildly around the room as if searching for a secret trapdoor to escape through. She realized her phantom shell company in Delaware was no longer a brilliant loophole, but a direct ticket to a federal prison cell. The bribed notary was completely paralyzed, trembling violently as he stared at the armed agents blocking his path to freedom. The lead FBI agent spoke with undeniable authority. He instructed everyone in the room to step away from the desk and to keep their hands entirely visible. He told them that this property was now an active federal crime scene and that nobody was permitted to leave the premises. Jonathan walked slowly across the room, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the floorboards. He stopped right next to my chair and looked down at my son. Jonathan told Derek that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He told him that he had brought a knife to a gunfight against the most dangerous businessman in the state of Texas. I remained seated in my leather chair, watching the absolute destruction of my son's shattered empire. I looked past Derek's terrified expression and glanced out the large bay window. The private medical transport, the custom ambulance they had hired to forcefully drag me to an insane asylum, was still idling quietly by the curb. The paramedics outside had no idea that the man they were supposed to lock away was the one currently dictating the terms of surrender. I turned my attention back to the room. The game of shadows was officially over. It was time for the final reckoning to begin. I kept my eyes locked on Derek as the absolute reality of his situation began to crush the breath right out of his lungs. He was trembling now, his expensive suit suddenly looking far too big for his shrinking frame. I watched his chest heave with panicked, ragged breaths. He opened his mouth to speak, to formulate some kind of defense or desperate lie, but his vocal cords completely failed him. I did not give him the chance to recover. I slowly reached down and opened the bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp, heavy cream-colored folder. I lifted it smoothly and tossed it directly onto the center of the desk, letting it land with a sharp, authoritative slap right on top of his 50-page fraudulent real estate contract. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk, and stared directly into my son's terrified eyes. "You think I am bankrupt?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal clarity through the silent study. "You think I am a broken old man who lost everything in a bad deal?" I gestured toward the folder resting on the desk. "Open it, Derek," I commanded. "Open it and read exactly what kind of man you tried to destroy today." Derek's hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the edge of the cover. He flipped the folder open. Resting inside was a certified bank statement carrying the official seal of my private wealth management institution. Printed in bold black ink at the very bottom of the ledger was the verified account balance. $80 million in liquid cash. Derek stared at the number, his jaw unhinged. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fragile ghost. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with an unimaginable horror. $80 million, I said, letting the weight of the number hang heavily in the tense air. I quietly finalized the sale of my entire logistics empire last week. Every truck, every warehouse, every contract was sold for $80 million in cash. And do you know what my plan was for that money, Derek? I was going to place every single penny into a highly secure, irrevocable family trust. I was going to name you as the primary beneficiary and the executive manager of that trust. I was going to hand you the keys to a generational fortune today. A strangled, choked gasp escaped from Derek's throat. His legs buckled slightly, and he had to grip the edge of the desk just to keep himself standing. I did not stop. I pressed forward, driving the knife of his own consequences deeper into his chest. "But my late wife, your mother, warned me about you before she died. She told me you loved money more than you loved your own family. I did not want to believe her, so I decided to test you. I gave you a fake story about a financial collapse to see if you would stand by my side or if you would leave me to drown. You did not just leave me to drown, Derek. You actively held my head under the water. You threw away 80 million legal dollars just to steal 3 million dirty ones. Rachel let out a loud, piercing sob from her place against the bookshelves. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, realizing the magnitude of the wealth she had just permanently thrown away. She had traded a life of unimaginable luxury for a federal indictment. But I was not finished dismantling their criminal illusion. I looked down at the 50-page contract they had placed in front of me. I pushed it away with the back of my hand. "And this house," I continued, my voice sharp and unwavering. "You thought you could trick me into signing the deed over to Apex Vista Holdings. You thought your little Delaware shell company was the perfect invisible vault for your stolen real estate. There is just one massive problem with your brilliant legal heist. I do not own this house anymore." Derek's eyes darted wildly around the room. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. I smiled, leaning back in my heavy leather chair. Jonathan Reed stepped forward, filling the silence with his booming, authoritative voice. "What your father means, Derek, is that he executed an irrevocable quitclaim deed early this morning," Jonathan explained, pointing a stern finger at my son. "The $3 million estate you are currently standing in was legally transferred to your sister Natalie in Seattle hours ago. The title has already been registered and certified by the county clerk. Your father does not have the legal capacity to sell this property to you or to anyone else. The contract you brought here today is completely worthless." The finality of Jonathan's words struck Derek like a physical blow. The invisible walls of the trap had completely closed around him. He realized he was not just walking away empty-handed. He was walking away with a mountain of evidence stacked against him. Jonathan was not finished. The ruthless attorney crossed his arms over his chest and delivered the fatal legal strike. "But you see, Derek, the worthless nature of this contract does not erase the criminal intent behind it," Jonathan continued. "You brought a fraudulent real estate agreement into this house. You conspired with your wife to defraud a senior citizen using a registered shell company. And worse, we have already fully documented the $2.5 million you embezzled from the Corporate Emergency Reserve Fund using a forged power of attorney. The fraud is entirely undeniable and strictly punishable by federal law." The lead FBI agent stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my son. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed sharply in the quiet study. "Derek Harrison and Rachel Harrison, the agent," said his voice booming with the full weight of the federal government. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and the forgery of legal documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I sat perfectly still, watching federal agents move in. The elaborate nightmare my son had constructed to destroy my life had completely collapsed. The trap had snapped shut exactly as I had designed it. Every single lie he told, every fake document he prepared, and every cruel manipulation he executed had simply become the evidence used to seal his own dark fate. There would be no escape. The reckoning had finally arrived. I felt nothing but a deep, profound sense of absolute justice as I watched my son's world burn to the ground completely and forever. The end of his reign of terror had finally come to a definitive and brutal conclusion. There will be no more lies, no more games. The logistics empire I built was finally safe from his greedy hands, exactly as I planned. The sharp click of the cold steel handcuffs echoing through my study was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard. Derek's knees completely gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, weeping like a terrified child. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, begging his daddy to tell the agents to stop. He pleaded with me, claiming that he was sorry and that he never truly meant to hurt me. I looked down at the boy I had raised. The boy who had calmly measured out industrial sedatives just a few hours earlier, and I felt absolutely nothing. Rachel began screaming hysterically, pulling against the restraints. She turned her venomous rage directly toward her husband, screaming that the entire fraudulent scheme was his idea and that she had been manipulated into participating. The FBI agents ignored her frantic protests, marching them both out of the study and through the front doors of the estate. I walked over to the large bay window and watched the scene unfold on the front lawn. The private medical transport, the custom ambulance they had eagerly hired to forcefully commit me to an insane asylum, was still idling by the curb. The paramedics watched in absolute stunned silence as the federal agents shoved Derek and Rachel into the back of the waiting police cruisers. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive oak trees Diane and I had planted together so many decades ago. The police cars drove away, leaving nothing but quiet peace in their wake. Over the following months, the entire criminal conspiracy was meticulously dismantled in federal court. Derek's desperate attempts to negotiate a lighter sentence completely failed because Jonathan had provided the prosecutors with an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable evidence. My son was formally sentenced to 15 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Rachel was sentenced to 8 years for her willing participation in the wire fraud and the creation of the offshore shell company. The violent loan shark syndicate that Derek owed the massive debt to was also raided and dismantled, utilizing the financial tracking data my investigators had uncovered. The logistics empire I had built was fully transferred to the multinational corporation for the agreed-upon $80 million. I did not stay in Dallas. The sprawling $3 million estate was sold by my daughter Natalie, and she kept the proceeds to ensure her own financial independence. I packed up the few meaningful possessions I had left, mostly photographs of Diane, and relocated to a beautiful, quiet home in the lush, green suburbs of Seattle. I wanted to be close to Natalie, the only child who had never once asked me for a single dime. I took a significant portion of my newfound $80 million wealth and established a massive legal defense fund. The foundation was specifically designed to provide aggressive, ruthless corporate attorneys for elderly individuals who were actively facing financial abuse and manipulation from their own greedy family members. I wanted to make absolutely certain that no other aging parent would ever have to feel the crushing terror of being forced into a psychiatric ward just so their ungrateful children could steal their life savings. I hired the sharpest legal minds in the country to fight back against the predators who hunt in the shadows of domestic life. I spent my days advising seniors sharing my story in community centers. I taught them how to recognize the subtle signs of manipulation, how to secure their assets properly, and how to understand that true love is never tied to financial leverage. This was my true legacy, a legacy built on absolute justice and unyielding protection. Every single day I wake up with a profound sense of purpose, knowing that the empire I built is being used to defend the innocent. I survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged stronger. The quiet peace that settled over my Dallas estate that afternoon was merely the calm before a relentless legal storm. Over the next several months, my entire reality shifted into a grueling cycle of federal courtrooms and endless depositions. I sat quietly in the polished wooden pews, watching the prosecutors meticulously dismantle the empire of lies my son had constructed. Derek's defense team tried every desperate tactic available, attempting to blame his actions on the extreme duress caused by the violent loan shark syndicate. They even tried to paint Rachel as the manipulative mastermind, but Jonathan Reed had provided an impenetrable fortress of irrefutable evidence. The audio recordings, the forged legal documents, and the offshore banking trails proved their calculated malice beyond any reasonable doubt. During the sentencing hearing, the judge allowed me to deliver a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium and looked directly at Derek, who was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit and staring at the floor in shame. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply told the courtroom that the hardest part of betrayal is not the financial loss, but the realization that the child you protected with your life was the one holding the knife in the dark. I told Derek that I forgave him for the money he stole, but I would never forgive him for attempting to erase my human dignity. The gavel slammed down, and my son was ultimately sentenced to 15 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Rachel received an 8-year sentence. With the criminal proceedings officially concluded, I had absolutely nothing left to tie me to the state of Texas. The $80 million sale of my logistics empire was finalized, and the capital was securely locked in a fortified private trust. Natalie, my fiercely independent daughter, managed the sale of the Dallas estate and utilized the proceeds to expand her surgical practice. She had never asked me for a single dime her entire life, and providing her with that financial security brought me immense comfort. I packed a small box of cherished photographs of Diane and boarded a flight to the Pacific Northwest. I purchased a beautiful home surrounded by towering evergreen trees in a quiet suburb of Seattle, just a short drive from Natalie. The cool, damp air of Washington felt like breathing in a second chance at life. I utilized a massive portion of my wealth to establish the Diane Harrison Legal Foundation. It is a powerful defense fund specifically engineered to protect vulnerable senior citizens from the devastating reality of domestic financial abuse. I hired a relentless team of elite attorneys who dedicate their lives to destroying the greedy relatives and predatory scammers who hunt the elderly. Our first major victory was recovering the stolen retirement funds of a 70-year-old widow from Austin. When I handed her the check restoring her entire life savings, she wept and held my hands. In that specific quiet moment, I knew that all the suffering had truly been worth it. I now spend my days traveling across the country, educating aging parents on how to recognize the subtle signs of manipulation and how to legally secure their hard-earned legacies. The horrific nightmare my son put me through became the exact weapon I used to save thousands of innocent people from losing their dignity. The deep sting of betrayal eventually faded away completely. It was replaced by a profound and unyielding sense of absolute purpose. I watched the sunset from the wooden deck of my new Seattle home, listening to the wind rustle through the pine branches. I realized that my son had tried to bury me alive, but he had only managed to plant a seed. The logistics empire I built was nothing compared to the powerful movement I had just started. It flourished. Money never changes people, it merely unmasks them. When you spend your entire life providing for your children, it is extremely easy to go blind to their true nature. We desperately want to believe that blood guarantees absolute loyalty, but unchecked greed is a vicious poison that knows absolutely no family tree. Never confuse your unconditional love for a requirement to remain someone's permanent victim. Sometimes the most brutal tests we run on the people we love are the only things that save our own lives. Protect your peace, secure your hard-earned legacy, and never become a silent prisoner. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to find out they were secretly waiting for you to fall? Share your unique story in the comments below. If this video empowered you, please hit the like button and subscribe so I can keep bringing you more stories of absolute justice today.